Hi, everyone, and hi, Emily. We start tonight with a group of heavily armored men who fought most of their problems by swinging metal at each other. Knights from the Middle Ages. Like the video and subscribe before you get too comfortable, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. You could turn on a fan for that soft noise in the background. Let's take it easy as we start our journey tonight. If movies were right about how medieval swords worked, every knight would have walked onto the battlefield smiling, sure of themselves, and probably humming a heroic theme song. Instead, most of them walked in thinking, if this sword is the only thing standing between me and death today, then I deeply regret every decision that brought me here. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. The sword was not the star of the show. In fact, it was barely the supporting actor. Knights didn't want to use their swords. Using your sword meant that everything else had already gone horribly wrong. Your lance broke, your spear broke, and your shield is somewhere behind you being trampled by a horse. And now you're standing in the mud, holding 3 pounds of metal, like, ah yes, Plan Z. It looked like two ballerinas practicing a violent waltz when they fought with swords in Hollywood. Real sword fights looked more like two tired construction workers fighting with crowbars. When you hit armor, it didn't politely open up. It just took the hit and made you realize how unimportant your hopes and dreams were. Swinging a sword at plate armor was like knocking on a door that would never open in the Middle Ages. Knights knew this too. That's why they didn't try to cut through armor. They looked for the weak spots in armor where it couldn't protect you, like the armpit, elbow gaps, throat openings, and the groin flap that no one could see. Wants to talk about. Medieval combat manuals are basically long, sad lists of all the ways you can stab a man and ruin his day. Half swording was one of the most charming and completely unrealistic techniques. A knight would grab his own sword with a gloved hand and use it like a spear. Yes, he grips the sword by the blade. No, he doesn't cut off his fingers. Unlike in many fantasy books, the edge of a medieval sword was not a laser razor made by angry elves. It was. It was sharp enough to hurt someone, but not so sharp that it would break your hand right away. You could count on swords. Of course, they were signs of status. They looked great on your hip, but in battle, they were as useful as a butter knife when a bear attacked. They were the break glass in case of emergency option, and the emergency usually broke you right away. Yes, swords are famous, but keep in mind that the universe had already let him down many times that day if he was using his sword. If you have. If you've ever seen a movie set in the Middle Ages, you probably noticed that no one ever grabs their sword by the blade. Why? Hollywood thinks that swords from the Middle Ages were glass-sharp laser beams that could cut through atoms. In the meantime, real knights were holding their swords like they were trying to choke them into behaving. Half-swording is a medieval fighting style that quickly separates real knights from people who like to dress up as knights. The idea was easy. If you can't cut, You can't get through armor, so you turn your sword into a short spear, grab the middle of the blade with your gauntleted hand, and start aiming for tiny gaps in the armor like you're trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. Half swording worked because medieval swords were sharp, but not so sharp that they would cut off your fingers. Pointy. They were tools, not things from myths. Knights wore thick leather gloves or plate gauntlets that helped them hold on better, protected them, and gave them just the right amount of false security. Confidence to try something that seems completely crazy by today's standards. The only reason to half sword was to be accurate and desperate. You weren't swinging wildly anymore. You were guiding a stabbing point with the same level of care as a surgeon, but you weren't a surgeon. While you were in a metal sauna, someone was trying to kill you. In the Middle Ages, fighting was like surgery, but with real life effects. The 1400s had a lot of beautifully illustrated instructions in their combat manuals, showing knights grabbing their swords, putting them in their armpits, opening their visors, and sometimes using the pommel like a hammer to get people to do what they want. These were serious martial arts moves, but they still look like two armored men were trying to fix a printer that was stuck with a lot of force. And let's be honest, half swording also happened because battlefields in the Middle Ages were sad places. There was mud, blood, screaming, and the sound of metal hitting metal for hours. Swinging a sword with all your might for that long would make your arms feel like wet noodles. Half swording let knights save energy while still being very effective. You won't ever see it in movies, of course. If actors grabbed the blade, it would ruin the mystery. Someone in the audience would also scream. He'd cut his hand off while holding their soda like a medieval combat expert, but real knights did it all the time. Because medieval fighting wasn't about looking cool, it was about staying alive long enough to be able to complain about it later, if. In medieval times, swords were a polite way to shake hands, and maces were an aggressive way to say, "Hello, I want you to stop being alive now." Knights didn't carry maces just because they looked cool. They carried them because armor made everything less fun. As soon as plate armor came out, swords started to complain. Swords were great for stabbing fabric, cutting flesh, and looking cool on horseback. But they were completely useless against someone who was wrapped in a few millimeters of forged steel. That's when the mace showed up, wearing sunglasses and carrying a blunt object that looked like something a medieval plumber would hate. A mace didn't cut, slice, or stab. It hit. It hurt a lot. And hitting someone in armor with a mace is less about skill and more about, let me introduce your skeleton to shockwaves. A well-placed mace hit could dent plate armor so badly that the victim would have to be pulled out like a puzzle piece that wasn't in the right place. In the Middle Ages, chronicles politely called these injuries significant, which is historian talk for the knight folded like laundry. Maces were meant to be simple, a stick, a weight, and maybe some spikes if the person who made it woke up feeling extra spicy. There was no complicated geometry or fancy metallurgy, just pure physics used with a lot of enthusiasm. Knights liked them because maces didn't care who you were. A mace was just as disappointing to a king, a peasant, a cleric, or an accountant. And to be honest, it took a lot less training to swing a mace than it did to learn how to use a sword. It took years of practice, discipline, and expensive lessons with a grumpy fencing master who smelled like onions to learn how to use a sword. It took about 30 seconds to train with a mace. Get up the mace. Quickly move mace toward the enemy. Keep doing this until the enemy stops moving. It was like smash that like button in the Middle Ages. Then there's the mental part. When you see someone running at you with a sword, you think, ah, a duel. When someone runs at you when you see a mace, you think, oh no, this man has given up on being classy. Maces were scary because they showed that the person using them wasn't there to have a good time. They were there to find long-term answers. Hollywood doesn't like maces because they aren't glamorous, but knights love them because they did their jobs. No fancy sword choreography, no perfectly timed clangs, just a lot of force that ends careers. If swords were medieval love stories, maces were the papers that ended the marriage. If a mace was like hitting someone in the Middle Ages, someone with a brick, then the warhammer was what happened when a blacksmith woke up one morning and said, what if we made a brick smarter? This weapon wasn't subtle. It didn't try to look fancy. It was made to fix one very specific issue. Armor made it really hard to kill people. In video games, warhammers are usually huge, shiny, and used by shirtless barbarians for no reason. In real life, though, warhammers were small, useful, and perfectly designed to ruin your opponent's afternoon. They usually had two ends, a blunt hammer face that could hit a man hard enough to make him think about his place in the universe, a sharp, narrow spike that can punch through armor joints like someone opening a tin can with too much excitement. The warhammer was a small siege engine that could fit in one hand. Let's talk about that point. It wasn't for show. It was a central point of medieval science. All the power of your body, your horse, and all the anger you've been holding in, all in one sharp tip. The good hit didn't bounce off like a sword. It went deep, helmet broken, the breastplate is broken, spine broken. The warhammer was scary, not because it was big, but because it worked so well. Knights didn't need to swing their swords hard. A quick, angry jab into the visor slit was all it took to end the fight, usually for good. Warhammers don't get a lot of flowery language in medieval combat manuals, but you can read between the lines. Use this to stab them. They will die. Another good thing about warhammers is that they didn't get stuck. Axes sometimes got stuck in armor or bone, which made it hard for the user to pull them out while being stabbed. A warhammer's spike, on the other hand, slid in and out with disappointing ease. Great for people who wanted to be fast, accurate, and not die. Hollywood doesn't show warhammers very often because they don't look heroic. A knight calmly stabbing someone in the head with a sword isn't very cinematic, seeing if a melon is ready to eat. But in the past, warhammers were the great equalizers, too small to notice, but too strong to ignore. If swords were for ceremonies and maces were for stress relief, than warhammers were for when a knight said, "I need this person gone." Swords were the polite, socially acceptable side of medieval violence, and axes were the part of the arsenal that said, "I didn't come here to impress anybody. I came here to ruin someone's whole week." People think that knights didn't use axes, but they did. Not the kind of axes that look like they belong in a hardware store. These were purpose-built combat axes that were lighter, faster, and much more judgmental. Battle axes from the Middle Ages weren't huge pieces of metal. They were smooth, effective weapons of destruction made by people who clearly had unresolved emotional problems. A good axe head focused force into a thin edge, which made it great for cutting through shields, splitting helmets, and chopping through anything the enemy carelessly left open. Knights liked axes for the same reason that people today like power tools. They get things done quickly. An axe didn't care how fancy your armor was, how noble your bloodline was, or what you said to inspire your troops before the battle. Things happened when that blade came down with a lot of anger and weight behind it. None of them good, but axes were more than just tools for people. Knights used the back hook or bearded axe head to pull shields out of the way, drag enemies off of horses, or pull someone close enough to hit them again and again, which destroyed family lines. Picture being armored on a horse and feeling a hook latch onto your shield like a medieval tow truck pulling you off your horse. That's how axe fighting felt. Axes were also very good at one important thing on the battlefield: breaking things made of wood. Spear shafts, barricades, shields, and doors. It was ready to end if it was made of wood in any way. Its being, there was a lot of wood on a medieval battlefield, and none of it lasted long around an angry knight with an axe. They were also cost-effective. Swordsmiths charged a lot of money, axe heads that are easy to use, cheap, and can be broken. Historians have a hard time figuring out class differences because even peasants could buy them. But the real reason knights used axes was because they worked on people who didn't want to be hit. Armor could bounce off, shields could block, and swords could miss. Axes. They figured out how to make you wish you had never worn metal. Hollywood doesn't like axes because they aren't stylish. Real knights liked them because style doesn't matter when you're trying not to get stabbed in a muddy field full of strangers yelling in Old French. Axes weren't very graceful, they worked. That was the only resume that mattered in medieval battles. If swords are the famous medieval weapons that are glamorous, overhyped, and always wrong, in that case, spears are the background actors who are paid too little and work too hard to keep the whole show together. People didn't write songs about spears. They didn't get ceremonial versions. There was no knight in shining armor who rode into a hall proudly holding up a spear to make it look better. But spears won more battles than all the swords in Europe put together. It was easy to make a spear, a long stick with a sharp end. That's all. No fancy blade shapes, no poetry about them, and no blacksmiths telling you old secrets about them. The metal. But when you're fighting in a muddy field with enemies who want to take your head off your financial responsibilities, it's nice to have things be simple. The first and most important thing to know is that spears could reach farther than anything else. Your enemy is close enough to smell your breath when you fight with swords. You can stab people with a spear from 2 meters away while still thinking about whether or not they look like someone who flosses. A good thrust with a spear kept danger away, which is the opposite of what Hollywood choreographers want. It was scary to spend the night on foot with a spear. A lance on horseback at night was legally considered a medieval missile. Spears and lances could break ribs, knock riders off their horses, and sometimes even send an unlucky opponent flying in an embarrassing way. Think about how hard it would be to knock someone off a horse so hard that their grandchildren feel it. Even peasants who weren't trained could use spears well, pointy end toward the enemy. That's the whole lesson. That's why generals in the Middle Ages loved spears. Your soldiers didn't need to learn how to fence for years. They needed a weapon and a general idea of where to put it. Spears were also the main weapons used by infantry. Shield walls, pike blocks, and phalanxes all work by putting sharp sticks in rows so close together that charging cavalry feels like running into a very angry wooden porcupine. And now let's talk about upkeep. Swords needed to be cleaned, sharpened, and cared for all the time. If you had a spear, you might have needed a new stick or even a new metal tip. A year of a lot of violence. They were like IKEA furniture for fighting in the Middle Ages, cheap, useful, and surprisingly strong when used right. Hollywood doesn't show spears very often because they make fights look too real. A spear duel is quick, effective, and scary. Not the dramatic 15-minute clang, clang, spin, twirl, and jump sequence that directors love, but real knights knew the truth. You prayed that your sword stayed in its sheath and your spear never left your hands if you wanted to live on the battlefield. You probably think a lance charge is cool if you've ever seen a jousting scene in a Hollywood movie. Two brave knights riding toward each other in slow motion, lances shining in the sun, violins getting louder, and everyone looking great. In real life, a lance charge was more like driving a metal oven in a medieval demolition derby without a license. Let's get to the point. A lance charge is like a car crash that you can control. A knight and his horse would speed up to. Full speed, lower a long wooden pole, pray to a few saints at once, and hope the other knight didn't have better aim. It was easy to understand the physics. The harder you hit, the more damage you did, and the more likely you were to fly off your horse like a sack of flour being thrown from a trebuchet. And it's not a lie that Hollywood's lances break into pieces. It's one of the few things they do well. Lances broke all the time. They were meant to. A strong, unbreakable lance would have. Turned every joust into a contest to see who could cut off the most heads, which medieval audiences might have liked too much. When lances were used in real battles, they were even more chaotic than in a neat tournament field with cheering nobles. The ground was bumpy, the air was dusty, and the person you were trying to hit was trying to kill you at high speed. This wasn't planned out. This wasn't very nice. Two armored men were playing chicken with huge skewers. If the lance hit the right spot, If your opponent falls off his horse, he could break several ribs or just lose interest in the fight. If it hit wrong, you could lose your grip, your balance, your dignity, and maybe even your lunch. Knights often fell, rolled, and groaned like metal turtles on their backs as they tried to get back on their feet before someone noticed and turned them into a footnote in the battle. Knights would throw away their lances as soon as they broke, which happened about every 30 seconds. Picked up swords, maces, axes, or anything else they could find. Lances were one-time use weapons, like single-shot missiles from the Middle Ages. People were still afraid of lances, though. A well-planned lance charge could break through enemy lines, scatter infantry, and cause chaos faster than attacks grow in a peasant village. They weren't fancy dueling weapons. They were shock weapons with a knight bolted to the back of them. If swords were for fighting and axes were for emergencies, lances were for times when you wanted to loudly and violently say, "I'm coming." If medieval weapons were tools for the home, the pax would be the crazy multi-tool your uncle keeps in his garage, the one with too many attachments and no safety instructions. Knights loved poleaxes because they were a simple, easy-to-swing weapon that could ruin someone's day in every way possible. Let's talk about anatomy first. A poleaxe was more than just an axe on a stick. No. Engineers in the Middle Ages did more than they had to. They put an axe blade on one side, a hammerhead on the other, and a tall, mean-looking spike sticking out the top like it had problems with people. Then they added metal strips to the handle to make it stronger so it wouldn't break during heated negotiations. The end result was a weapon that could chop, smash, stab, hook, pry, puncture, and sometimes open bottles. If the warhammer was a can opener for armor, the poleaxe was the whole kitchen drawer. Hollywood never shows paxes because they are too real. When knights used them, the fighting didn't look like fancy fencing or duels that were perfectly choreographed. It looked like two armored men in a medieval home improvement store were violently testing how strong each other's helmets were. Yes, knights did use poleaxes in tournaments. Fights were basically two heavily armored people trying to hit each other in the head with physics while an audience clapped politely. The manuals talk about techniques like strike, the head, the body, and anything else that is there. These instructions are not very helpful. Pole axes were the great equalizers on the battlefield. They fought against mail armor, plate armor, no armor, and too much armor. The weapon didn't care who it hit. The hammer side bent the metal like it was aluminum foil. The axe side cut through shields and bones. The spike at the top is perfect for finding that one miserable gap between armor plates and using it as a way to get to the afterlife. Pole axes were also great for fighting. Knights used the hook or head to knock enemies off balance, pull shields aside, or bring someone close enough to stab. If you got caught, good job. You were now the unwilling star of a medieval wrestling match, but your opponent had a huge stick that could kill you. And even with all of this, paxes were surprisingly elegant, not in how they looked, but in how they were made. Every fescite had a reason for being there. Every hit was effective. No wasted movement. just solving problems like they did in the Middle Ages. If swords were art, paxes would be engineering, and in a world where everyone was angry, armored, and sweaty, engineering won a lot more fights. The sword was a knight's status symbol, the pax was his I'm done being polite weapon, and the dagger was his I'm about to get personal tool. Daggers didn't look very cool. They didn't shine. They didn't have names that were very dramatic, like Heartseeker or King's Bite. They were small, plain, and very honest, just like life in the Middle Ages. Knights didn't carry daggers for flair. They brought them because every fight, no matter how big it started, ended up with two armored men rolling around in the mud like angry turtles. And when someone is trying to take your lunch money and your life while you're wrestling in 60 pounds of steel, you don't swing a sword. You pull out something sharp. The best style is to go straight into the gaps, neck openings, armpits, eye slits, and groin plates. Sadly effective. Armor from the Middle Ages was good, but it couldn't protect everything, or the knights would have died from the heat before the enemy even got there. Daggers were made to take advantage of the weak spots in the armor layout. Real medieval daggers were short, stiff, and very useful, unlike movie daggers that are big, shiny, and held backwards by people who have never taken a fencing lesson. A knight wasn't trying to stab. He was trying to put the blade in a spot that would ruin the other guy's week. The rondelle was one of the most famous types. Dagger, a thick triangular spike that looked like it would work to stab a bag of grain that was being stubborn. Great for getting between armor plates and stopping someone from breathing. It was like a modern-day precision screwdriver. If screwdrivers were made to end bloodlines, combat manuals from the time show knights grappling, pinning, and driving daggers down into visors like they were trying to open a jar that wouldn't budge. These aren't very elegant. There are no flowing dance moves or pictures, just two men thinking about what chivalry means. But daggers weren't just for killing, they were also useful tools. Knights used them to cut rope, cook food, fix armor straps, carve wood, and, in one case, do surgery on the battlefield. Yes, that's right. The same knife that a knight might use to end a duel quietly could also be used to cut an apple or pull out an arrow. The best example of multitasking in the Middle Ages. Hollywood usually doesn't pay attention to daggers because they're not flashy enough, but ask a knight. The dagger was often the last thing that signed a very violent contract. Daggers were small compared to other medieval weapons, but they had a huge effect. Swords are the most famous weapons from the Middle Ages, and maces are the tools of the time for solving problems. Shields, on the other hand, are the unsung heroes, the tired, overworked, and underappreciated workers on the battlefield who kept everything from falling apart. Knights didn't carry shields just to look good. They carried shields because it is surprisingly hard to stay alive when everyone around you is trying to kill you. A shield was more than just a piece of wood. Oh no, shields were complicated, strong, and made in a way that only someone who lived in the Middle Ages would understand. They were made up of layers of wood, rawhide, glue, metal edging, and sometimes paint. It probably took longer for them to dry than the knight thought he would live. They weren't for show. In the Middle Ages, they were like carrying a wall around with you. Hollywood shows shields as polite, obedient things, always raised to stop a sword swing that the villain could have predicted. Real shields were weapons. Knights used them to punch, shove, slam, bash, and sometimes help someone get to the ground faster. Imagine a man in armor running at you with a wooden door on his arm. That's fighting with shields. A good shield bash could knock a man off balance, stun him, break his teeth, or even knock him out of the fight before he even swung his sword. Took place. Knights also weren't afraid to use the edge of their shields like a knife. If you hit someone sideways with enough medieval enthusiasm, that rim could break ribs and collapse lungs. And then there's how it looks. Different shapes meant different jobs. Kite shields are great for cavalry and also great for turning wind resistance into a full body workout. Heaters that are smaller, lighter, and less likely to rip your arm off when someone hits it. Round shields are great for smashing a Viking in the face if you suddenly found yourself in Scandinavia. Shields were also places where people could give orders. Knights put heraldry on them, not because it looked cool in paintings, but because on a chaotic battlefield full of armored clones, a fancy yellow lion helped your friends figure out which side you were supposed to be smashing. Of course, shields broke all the time. If an axe hit one hard enough, it could split it in half, leaving the knight with what was now a sad, expensive pizza slice. But that was the point. It's better for the shield to break than for your bones to break. In the end, shields were the quiet, reliable worker in the office of war who did all the hard work while the sword got all the credit. If you think that fighting in the Middle Ages was a dignified exchange of sword blows between two noble warriors, I'm sorry to say that you're very wrong and may be watching too many fantasy movies that look like shampoo commercials. In real life, knightly battles often ended with two heavily armored men rolling around in the mud like very angry armadillos. Yes, knights did wrestle a lot, more than you'd think for people who wore 60 pounds of steel and tried to keep their noble reputations. Grappling wasn't a rare way to handle an emergency. It was a normal part of training. People who liked drawing pictures of men falling over wrote medieval combat manuals that were full of throws, tackles, joint locks, leg sweeps, and ways to knock someone off balance while politely crushing their windpipe. They even added cute pictures of knights flipping each other upside down like armored acrobats who made a lot of bad choices in life. It was easy to understand the logic. When you're close enough to grab your opponent, swinging a sword is about as useful as swinging a baguette. Knights would get closer, grab the edges of each other's armor, twist their limbs, hook their legs, and slam each other into the ground with enough force to make modern wrestlers cry. And since the armor took so much damage, they could really go all in on these moves without dying right away, which made grappling matches very chaotic and very undignified. The goal is to get the enemy on the ground. Once he's down, it will take him a while to get back up. The most powerful weapon in the Middle Ages was gravity. And what do you do when he's down? You move on to the chapter your mother told you not to ask about, the dagger. The winner would plant a knee and grab a rondel dagger while the loser flailed around like a beetle that had been turned over. Make the other guy's armor stop getting in the way of the stabbing. Grappling also helped break grips, take away weapons, or just some to wear down opponents through bullying. Knights would sometimes fight because their weapons got stuck in armor, other times because they couldn't see well, and still other times because they fell. Yes, a lot of medieval battles happened because people slipped in mud, blood, or the medieval version of banana peels. This is never shown in Hollywood because it takes away the romance. Salalent of House Sparkle Fountain's clumsy body slam of his opponent into a puddle is the quickest way to end the fantasy. But real knights knew the truth. If nothing else works, grab the enemy and throw him to the ground like a sack of potatoes from the Middle Ages. It wasn't chivalry, noble ideals, or good hygiene that made knights great. It was armor. Armor was their portable insurance policy, their walking safety deposit box, and their please don't outfit to stab me today. But real medieval armor was surprisingly easy to move around in, unlike Hollywood's clunky tin cans that make every knight walk like they're stuck in a broken vending machine. Knights could run, jump, climb ladders, do flips, and even dance, though not very well. Armor changed over time to protect knights long enough for them to complain about the fight later. Men were safe from cuts. Plate protected against almost everything except the force of gravity, higher taxes, and sarcasm. A knight in full plate armor was like a tank from the Middle Ages, and like all tanks, the goal was to be really hard to kill. But let's set the record straight. Armor wasn't too heavy to carry. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, which is about the same as what soldiers carry today. And instead of the weight hanging off your shoulders like a cursed gym workout, plate armor spread it out over your whole body, making it much easier to move around in. Knights didn't waddle, they walked. Waddled. Mobility wasn't the real problem with armor. It was the temperature. If you wore a steel oven in the middle of a battlefield, you would sweat about half your body weight every hour. It was like a sauna inside that helmet, but with bad airflow and a 100% chance of weapons coming in. Knights had to choose between lifting their visor to get some fresh air or keeping it shut to avoid getting stabbed in the face by someone else's spear. Fights also lasted longer because of armor. Longer, and sometimes way too long. A knight's armor protected him from blows that would have turned an unarmored peasant into battlefield jam. Instead, the blows bounced off with a loud, echoing bonk that meant he was alive and a little annoyed. That's why weapons got stronger over time. Hammers, maces, paxes, and just about anything else that could smash armor and hurt the person inside. But armor wasn't always perfect. There were gaps. Elbows, armpits, groins, and other places that no one wants to think about during a fight suddenly became very valuable for stabs, spikes, and dagger thrusts. Knights knew that their armor kept them safe, but they also knew that one unlucky poke in the armpit could ruin their whole month. armor was amazing, a work of art in medieval engineering, but it was also hot, tiring, and sometimes embarrassing when a knight fell in the mud and needed a friend to help him get back up. If movies were true, battles in the Middle Ages would have been polite. One knight moves forward, and then another knight moves forward. They give each other dramatic speeches, and then they do a beautifully choreographed duel where everyone waits their turn in a respectful way. But real medieval battles were less like honorable fights and more like a metal riot in a barn that was about to fall down. First of all, the thought of a clean one-on-one fight is cute. If you stopped to fight someone on a real battlefield, at least 8 other people would run over and stab you in different places before your dramatic introduction was over. In the Middle Ages, war was not fair. It wasn't like a movie. It was a free-for-all with a lot of people and mud, and teamwork meant don't stab the guy wearing the same colors as you. Visibility was terrible. Knights wore helmets with slits the width of a frown. There was a lot of smoke, dust, and the screams of people who clearly chose the wrong career path on the battlefield. Knights didn't always know who they were hitting. You swung, you prayed, and you hoped it wasn't your cousin. Footing was also a nightmare. There was mud, blood, broken weapons, and loose rocks. People who were fighting kept slipping. Knights fell down so often that medieval warfare might have been the first time people made fun of themselves physically. It doesn't look good to fizzle while wearing full armor. It was like watching a fridge try to do yoga, and getting up was even worse. When the knight was thrashing around like a turtle in pain, his enemies often took the chance to hit him in the head with a mace. The formations didn't stay neat either. Textbook lines of battle turned. Within minutes turned into tangled mosh pits. The infantry crashed into each other. The cavalry broke through both friend and foe. Archers tried to shoot over the chaos, but they often hit people they cared about. No one heard the orders that commanders yelled. It was a miracle that battles ever stopped. People didn't die in dramatic duels. They died from being too tired, too thirsty, too hot inside their armor, or being trampled by a horse that was just as scared and confused about its life choices as they were. Most deaths didn't happen because of sword fighting that is elegant. They included a man who was too tired to lift his shield again. Hollywood hides the truth because it's not neat. The real battlefield was not a stage. It was a disaster zone that was too crowded and too loud, and the only way to stay alive was to be aware, strong, and angry. So, no, knights didn't fight each other in the middle of a battle like they do in movies. They got through medieval battles the same way we get through Mondays, by moving forward, avoiding danger, and hoping everyone else was too, having a worse day than you. If you've ever wondered why knights in the Middle Ages had so many different weapons, the answer is simple. Nothing ever worked for everyone. A knight picking out weapons was like a handyman in the Middle Ages, opening a toolbox full of tools that could only fix very specific, very unpleasant problems. Hollywood acts like knights fought with one signature sword, like they were role-playing characters with strong personal brands. But real knights changed weapons faster than people. Today change Wi-Fi. Networks. Each weapon had a purpose. a very specific task. Take the sword, good for cutting peasants who aren't wearing armor, bad for cutting knights who look like steel pumpkins. The club, great for breaking through armor, bad for getting in touch with people more than 2 feet away. The spear was great for keeping danger at arm's length, but as soon as someone got too close, it felt like a very long, very inconvenient broom handle. Knights knew that the battlefield wasn't a polite place. You couldn't count on one weapon because battles were always changing, messy, and very unpleasant. 1 minute you're on horseback with a lance. Your horse suddenly decides it's had enough of your nonsense and politely throws you into a ditch. You need a sword, a dagger, or therapy now. You have to settle for the dagger, though, because therapy hadn't been invented yet. Bring a hammer or mace to fight plate armor. Use an axe or a thrusting sword against mail armor, against someone. If you want to run away, try a spear. Long reach. A great way to get someone who is too close to you to back off. Use the dagger to fight someone who is on horseback. A pole axe is great against someone who has better armor, better aim, and better morale. Go, correct in terms of history. Knights didn't collect weapons just because they looked cool. They were playing it safe. You brought a mace to crush, a sword to stab, a dagger to finish, a spear to poke, and maybe a warhammer just in case someone got any ideas. If knights. If they could have carried a flamethrower from the Middle Ages, they would have. Weapons changed with the seasons. Long weapons were hard to use in muddy fields. Spears were hard to use in forests. Swords were useless in tight formations. And everything made the horses nervous, because horses are known for not caring about your shiny armor or good intentions. All they want is to stay alive. In short, knights did what worked. Weapons were not selected for reasons of honor, beauty, or symbolism. They were chosen for their ability to work quickly, stay alive, and get the most out of their time. Discouragement of foes. The movies give knights their own weapons. History gave them a list of things to buy. The romantic image of the medieval knight as noble, shining, graceful, and heroic is a beautiful piece of fiction made up by poets, painters, and people who weren't there when knights were real. The real knight was a battlefield athlete, a tactical bruiser, and a walking sauna who was always sweating, sore, and sorry for what he did. Don't worry about being elegant. A knight spent 20% of his time training and 10% of his time. 70% of the time they were fighting, and 30% of the time they were complaining about it. Training included lifting heavy weapons, running in armor, riding horses that didn't want to cooperate, and practicing moves that required both the agility of a gymnast and the patience of a saint. And you were wearing layers of fabric, padding, and steel that made your body feel like a pressure cooker. Knights were strong, but not like bodybuilders. They had to carry your armor, swing a weapon over and over, climb a wall, avoid heat stroke, and fight for your life for 30 minutes straight, strong, the kind of strength that comes from need, not from protein shakes. Knights weren't calm or well-mannered on the battlefield. They were survivors who knew how to use tactics. Every choice was important. When to charge, when to fall back, when to grapple, when to switch weapons, when to retreat, when to pretend to retreat, and when to scream for help because your foot got stuck in another corpse. They fought with brains. They knew how to use leverage, angle, weight distribution, and positioning. They were aware which weapons worked against which armor and which weapons to avoid, unless they wanted their obituary to read, "Died trying something stupid," and the sweat, oh, the sweat. Knights sweated in winter. They sweated in the shade. They sweated during training, during combat, and during any activity that involved existing inside armor. Their under-a-rower padding probably smelled like a mixture of wet dog, despair, and yesterday's dinner. Yet, despite all the grime, chaos, and bodily discomfort, knights were professionals. They were trained, disciplined, and shockingly effective. They mastered an entire ecosystem of weapons, tactics, and techniques that Hollywood refuses to acknowledge because the truth is far messier, louder, and funnier. The real knight wasn't a heroic statue come to life. He was a gritty, tactical problem solver, wearing 60 pounds of overheating metal, swinging whichever tool kept him alive the longest. And yes, he was always sweaty. Theodora's life did not begin in marble halls or perfume chambers, but in the